The emergency session of the Galactic Trade Council had been called with unprecedented urgency, bringing together representatives from 47 member species to address what they termed the human problem. Admiral Kethvar of the Hegemony Fleet Command stood before the assembled delegates, his four arms gesticulating as he outlined humanity's latest transgression against galactic order. "The humans have done it again," he announced, his translator rendering his chittering language into standard galactic. 3 more consortium mining operations have been shut down due to what they call humanitarian violations. They're interfering with legitimate resource extraction because they claim we're exploiting native populations. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The humans had been a persistent source of irritation since their admission to galactic society 20 years earlier. Unlike other species, who understood that galactic civilization required certain accommodations and compromises, humans seemed incapable of accepting that some populations were simply less developed and therefore naturally suited for resource extraction labor. "The situation has become untenable," continued Counselor Zixtha of the Silicon Collective, her crystalline form pulsing with agitated light patterns. "Human peacekeeping forces have established themselves in 17 different star systems, ostensibly to protect primitive species from exploitation. But their real purpose is clearly to disrupt established trade relationships and economic partnerships. They claim to be preventing slavery," added Representative Morgeth of the Resource Extraction Guild. "But they fail to understand that these populations are being provided with shelter, food, and purpose in exchange for their labor. It's a fair arrangement that benefits everyone involved." The humans had a fundamentally different understanding of concepts like consent, fair compensation, and individual rights. While galactic civilization had long ago accepted that some species were naturally suited for manual labor, while others were better adapted for intellectual pursuits, humans insisted that all sapient beings deserved what they called dignity and freedom of choice. "The economic disruption has been substantial," reported Trade Administrator Velkin. 17 major extraction operations have been abandoned due to human interference. Resource costs have increased by 30% across affected sectors. Several member species are reconsidering their participation in consortium projects due to human harassment. "Harassment?" asked Counselor Jexhai of the Harmony Syndicate. "Human ships arriving uninvited in sovereign systems. Human personnel demanding to inspect working conditions and interview laborers. Human diplomats filing formal complaints about practices that have been standard for millennia." The frustration in the chamber was palpable. The humans had somehow gotten the idea that their primitive concepts of individual rights and economic justice should apply throughout galactic civilization. They seemed incapable of understanding that different species had different capabilities, and that galactic society functioned through natural hierarchies that maximized efficiency and productivity. "The fundamental problem," Admiral Kethvar continued, "is that humans believe their moral framework should supersede established galactic law and custom. They've appointed themselves as enforcers of principles that aren't recognized by galactic civilization. And they have the military capacity to enforce their preferences," added General Hickster of the Defense Coordination Authority. "Human military technology is concerning. Their ships are more heavily armed than anything we've seen from a species at their development level." This was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the human situation. Most species required thousands of years to develop the technological and social sophistication necessary for effective space warfare. Humans had achieved comparable capabilities in mere decades, and their approach to military technology seemed to prioritize destructive capacity over efficiency or elegance. "What are our options?" asked Counselor Zixtha. "We've tried diplomatic approaches," Admiral Kethvar replied. "Formal complaints, economic sanctions, isolation protocols, nothing has deterred their interference with legitimate galactic commerce." "What about military pressure?" "Problematic. Human ships are built I'm not sure how to describe it. Like they expect to fight opponents with superior numbers and technology. Their defensive capabilities are extraordinary, and their weapon systems are designed for rapid deployment and maximum damage." "Are you saying we can't militarily contain a single species that's been spacefaring for less than a century?" Counselor Jexhai asked incredulously. "I'm saying that humans approach warfare differently than any species we've encountered. Most civilizations develop military technology for defense and deterrence. Humans seem to have developed it for winning conflicts against superior opponents. The discussion continued for hours, covering various approaches to the human problem. Trade restrictions had proven ineffective because humans were largely self-sufficient and seemed to prefer isolation to compromise. Diplomatic isolation had simply prompted them to establish relationships with non-council species. Economic sanctions had hurt council members more than humans. "There is one option we haven't discussed," said Administrator Velkin quietly, which is termination of council membership and expulsion from galactic civilization. The chamber fell silent. Expulsion was the ultimate sanction, reserved for species that posed existential threats to galactic order. It had been used only 3 times in galactic history, and never against a species with humanity's military capabilities. "The precedent is concerning," observed General Hickster. "If we expel humans for refusing to accept galactic norms, other young species might conclude that council membership is optional." "But if we don't act," Admiral Kethvar replied, "humans might conclude that they can impose their values on galactic civilization without consequences." What would expulsion accomplish? It would formally recognize that humans are not compatible with galactic civilization and relieve us of any obligation to consider their concerns in our decision-making. And if they refuse to accept expulsion, then we enforce it. The vote was surprisingly close, 24 in favor of expulsion, 22 opposed, with 1 abstention. The margin was narrow enough that several representatives called for reconsideration, but Admiral Kethvar insisted that the decision stood. "The human delegation will be informed of the Council's decision immediately," he announced. "They have 30 standard days to remove all human personnel from Council space and cease interference with Council operations." Ambassador Sarah Chen received the expulsion notice while her ship was docked at Nexus Station, the massive trading hub that served as the capital of galactic civilization. She read the formal document twice before requesting an emergency meeting with the Council leadership. "This is unprecedented," she told Admiral Kethvar when they met in his private office. "No species has ever been expelled from the Council for Humanitarian Advocacy. No species has ever attempted to impose their moral framework on galactic civilization," he replied. "Humans seem to believe that your concepts of individual rights and economic justice should override thousands of years of established galactic law. We believe that sapient beings shouldn't be enslaved, regardless of what you call it or how you justify it. You call it slavery. We call it structured labor relationships that provide mutual benefit to all participants." Mutual benefit? The workers are kept in substandard housing, paid below subsistence wages, and forbidden to leave. How is that beneficial to them? They receive shelter, food, medical care, and productive occupation. Many of these populations were struggling to survive on their own worlds before Council assistance. Council assistance that happens to involve strip mining their planets and forcing them to work in dangerous conditions. Admiral Kethvar's forearms clicked together in a gesture of dismissal. This is exactly the kind of moral absolutism that makes humans incompatible with galactic civilization. You see exploitation where we see opportunity. You see oppression where we see structure. We see sapient beings being treated as property. You see what you want to see. The Council has made its decision. Humans have 30 days to withdraw from Council space. And if we refuse, then the Council will enforce its decision through appropriate measures. Ambassador Chen left the meeting with a heavy heart. She'd known this moment might come, but she'd hoped that reason and diplomacy might prevail. The Council's decision to expel humanity rather than address legitimate concerns about exploitation and abuse suggested that galactic civilization was less enlightened than it claimed to be. Her next transmission to Earth was brief and formal. "Council has voted for expulsion, 30 days to withdraw, enforcement threatened if we refuse to comply." The response from Earth took 18 hours to arrive, during which Ambassador Chen found herself wondering what humanity's options actually were. They could comply with the expulsion order and withdraw to human space, abandoning the enslaved populations they'd been trying to protect. They could refuse to comply and face military action from the combined fleets of galactic civilization. Or they could find some third option that nobody had yet articulated. When Earth's response finally arrived, it consisted of a single sentence. "Understood. Begin immediate withdrawal of all diplomatic and civilian personnel." Ambassador Chen was surprised by the swift compliance. She'd expected Earth to protest the expulsion order or demand reconsideration. Instead, they seemed to be accepting the Council's decision with unexpected grace. Over the following weeks, human personnel throughout Council space began the complex process of withdrawal. Diplomatic missions were closed, trade relationships were terminated, and peacekeeping forces were recalled from the 17 systems where they'd been protecting vulnerable populations. The process was conducted with remarkable efficiency and minimal drama. Humans seemed genuinely committed to complying with the expulsion order, rather than creating additional conflict. Several council members privately expressed surprise at how reasonable humans were being about the situation. Perhaps we misjudged their commitment to galactic civilization, Councillor Zixta observed during one of the regular briefings on human withdrawal progress. They seem to be accepting expulsion with more grace than anticipated. Or they're planning something, Admiral Kethavar replied grimly. Humans don't abandon causes they believe in, they're withdrawing too easily. What could they be planning? They're outnumbered 47 to 1, and they're being expelled from galactic civilization. What options do they have? Admiral Kethavar didn't have an answer to that question, but his instincts told him that human compliance was temporary and strategic, rather than genuine acceptance of the Council's decision. His concerns proved justified exactly 31 days after the expulsion order was issued. The first sign of trouble came from the Rigel Mining Consortium, which operated the largest resource extraction facility in Council space. The operation employed nearly 2 million workers from 17 different primitive species, extracting rare minerals from the moon of Kepler 442b under carefully controlled conditions that maximized productivity while minimizing overhead costs. We're detecting massive gravitational anomalies in the outer system, reported Station Controller Vexon to Admiral Kethavar. Multiple large objects are approaching from beyond sensor range. What kind of objects? Unknown. The signatures are consistent with ship formations, but the size readings are unprecedented. Admiral Kethavar immediately ordered the Hegemony 4th Fleet to investigate the anomalies. What they found defied every assumption about human military capabilities and strategic thinking. Admiral, reported Fleet Commander Tixol, we're looking at what appears to be the entire human space fleet. Approximately 2,000 vessels of various classes, approaching in standard battle formation. 2,000 vessels? Our intelligence estimates indicated that humans possessed fewer than 300 combat-capable ships. Sir, these aren't just combat vessels. We're detecting construction ships, support vessels, transport vessels, and what appear to be mobile manufacturing platforms. They're bringing their entire civilization? It appears so, sir. And Admiral, these aren't the same ships we've seen before. The technology signatures are completely different. More advanced. Much more advanced. Admiral Kethavar was beginning to understand what humans had been doing during their month of withdrawal. They hadn't been accepting expulsion gracefully. They'd been preparing for war. What are your tactical assessments? Sir, I'm not sure we have tactical options. The human fleet isn't just larger than our intelligence indicated. It's qualitatively different from anything we've seen. Their ships are... I'm not sure how to describe it. They look like they were built specifically for fighting opponents with superior numbers and technology. How is that possible? They've been a spacefaring species for less than a century. I don't know, sir. But they're not acting like a species that's been expelled from galactic civilization. They're acting like a species that's come to impose their will on galactic civilization. The human fleet continued its approach toward the Rigel system, maintaining perfect formation and ignoring all attempts at communication. Admiral Kethavar ordered the 4th Fleet to establish a defensive perimeter around the mining operation, but his tactical officers were already expressing doubts about their ability to protect the facility. Sir, reported Tactical Coordinator Hixlin, the human ships are configured in ways we've never seen. Heavy armor, redundant systems, and weapon loadouts that suggest they're designed to fight prolonged engagements against multiple opponents. What's our fleet composition? 47 ships of the line, including 3 dreadnoughts and 12 heavy cruisers. Standard Council fleet configuration optimized for system patrol and minor conflict resolution. Against 2,000 human vessels? Sir, it's not just the numbers. Our ships are designed for efficiency and multi-purpose operations. Theirs appear to be designed exclusively for combat. They've optimized for different priorities. Admiral Kethavar was beginning to realize that the Council had fundamentally misunderstood what kind of species they were dealing with. Most civilizations developed military technology as a necessary but regrettable tool for occasional conflicts. Humans seem to have developed it as their primary means of interacting with a hostile universe. "Admiral," reported Communications Officer Velfi, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was calm, professional, and utterly implacable. "This is Admiral Marcus Webb of the Earth Fleet. You are ordered to cease resource extraction operations immediately and release all sapient beings currently held in working conditions that violate basic standards of dignity and consent." Admiral Kethvar responded immediately. "This is Admiral Kethvar of the Hegemony 4th Fleet. You are in violation of Council space sovereignty. Your species has been expelled from galactic civilization. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Admiral Kethvar, the Galactic Trade Council voted to expel humanity rather than address legitimate concerns about widespread enslavement and exploitation. We are here to address those concerns directly. The workers at this facility are here voluntarily under established labor agreements. Admiral, we've been monitoring communications from this facility for 3 years. The workers are kept in substandard housing, forced to work in dangerous conditions, paid below subsistence wages, and prevented from leaving. These are not voluntary labor agreements. This is slavery. Your moral framework is not recognized by galactic civilization. Our moral framework recognizes the inherent dignity of sapient beings regardless of their technological development level or species of origin. We're not here to impose our framework on galactic civilization. We're here to liberate beings who are being held against their will. And if we refuse to comply with your demands—" The pause that followed was brief but somehow ominous. "Admiral, you're outnumbered 47-1. Your ships are designed for patrol and peacekeeping. Ours are designed for war against superior opponents. You cannot protect this facility, and you cannot prevent us from liberating the workers. The only question is whether you're going to force us to go through you to do it." Admiral Kethvar found himself in an impossible position. The human assessment was probably correct. His fleet couldn't prevent 2,000 human vessels from overwhelming the mining facility. But allowing humans to violate Council sovereignty would set a precedent that could destabilize galactic civilization. Admiral Webb, if you proceed with this action, you'll be declaring war on the entire Galactic Trade Council. Admiral Kethvar, the Council declared war on basic decency when it chose expulsion over addressing systematic abuse of sapient beings. We're simply responding to your declaration. You can't fight the entire galaxy. We're not fighting the entire galaxy. We're fighting the parts of the galaxy that think enslaving primitive species is acceptable business practice. The conversation ended when Admiral Webb cut the communication channel. The human fleet continued its approach, maintaining formation and showing no signs of hesitation or uncertainty. "Orders, sir?" asked Fleet Commander Tix Hall. Admiral Kethvar realized that he was facing a decision that would determine the future of galactic civilization. If he ordered his fleet to engage the humans, he would be starting a war that could spread throughout Council space. If he allowed the humans to proceed, he would be admitting that the Council couldn't enforce its own sovereignty. "Sir," Tactical Coordinator Hixlin reported urgently, "the human fleet is launching assault craft, thousands of them. They're bypassing our defensive position entirely." "How is that possible?" "They're not trying to engage our fleet, sir. They're conducting what appears to be a massive planetary assault operation, focused solely on the mining facility." Admiral Kethvar watched his tactical displays with growing amazement and horror. The human fleet had deployed what appeared to be the largest military operation in galactic history, not to conquer territory or destroy enemies, but to liberate enslaved workers. "Admiral," reported Communications Officer Velthi, "we're receiving transmissions from the mining facility. Human forces have landed and are engaging security personnel." "What's the nature of the engagement?" "Sir, it appears to be remarkably restrained. Humans are using non-lethal weapons and focusing on securing the worker housing areas rather than destroying facility infrastructure." "They're not trying to destroy the operation?" "No, sir. They appear to be conducting a liberation operation, specifically designed to extract the workers while minimizing casualties and infrastructure damage." Admiral Kethvar was beginning to understand that humans approached warfare with the same moral framework that had gotten them expelled from the Council. They weren't trying to destroy their enemies or seize territory. They were trying to accomplish specific humanitarian objectives with minimal collateral damage. "Sir," Fleet Commander Tixhole reported, "human ground forces have secured all worker housing areas and are beginning evacuation operations. They've established defensive perimeters around the extraction zones, but haven't attacked any facilities that aren't directly related to worker confinement." "How many casualties?" "Minimal, sir. Human forces appear to be using sophisticated non-lethal weapons and medical support systems. Even security personnel who resisted are being treated and evacuated." "They're providing medical care to enemy combatants?" "Yes, sir. Human military doctrine apparently includes immediate medical treatment for all casualties, regardless of affiliation." The operation continued for 6 hours, during which human forces systematically evacuated nearly 2 million enslaved workers from the mining facility. They provided immediate medical care, temporary housing, and transportation to designated safe zones that had been established throughout the system. Admiral Communications Officer Velthy reported as the evacuation neared completion, "We're receiving another transmission from Admiral Webb." "Put it through." "Admiral Kithavar, evacuation operations are nearly complete. We've successfully liberated 1.97 million sapient beings, who were being held in conditions that violated basic standards of dignity and consent. Medical teams have treated 847 individuals for malnutrition, 1,203 for untreated injuries, and 15,671 for various diseases related to substandard living conditions. What are your intentions now?" "We're providing temporary transportation and housing for evacuated populations while they decide where they want to go and what they want to do. Some will return to their homeworlds, others have requested asylum in human space. All will be given genuine choices about their futures." "And the mining facility?" "Will be returned to Council control once all sapient beings have been safely evacuated. We're not interested in seizing territory or destroying property. We're interested in ending slavery. The Council will consider this an act of war. The Council is welcome to consider it whatever they want. We'll be conducting similar operations at 16 other locations where sapient beings are being held against their will." The transmission ended, leaving Admiral Kathivar to contemplate the implications of what had just occurred. The humans had demonstrated military capabilities that far exceeded Council intelligence estimates. But they'd used those capabilities for humanitarian purposes, rather than conquest or destruction. Over the following weeks, human forces conducted liberation operations at 17 different sites throughout Council space. Each operation followed the same pattern: overwhelming force deployment, precise targeting of worker confinement areas, minimal casualties, comprehensive medical care for all affected individuals, and voluntary relocation assistance for liberated populations. The Council's attempts to organize military resistance proved futile. Human forces seemed to have perfect intelligence about Council fleet movements, superior technology, and tactical approaches that Council military doctrine had never anticipated. "They fight like they expect to be outnumbered and outgunned," General Hickster reported to an emergency Council session. "Every ship, every weapon, every tactic is optimized for scenarios where they face superior opponents." "How is that possible?" asked Councillor Zixtha. "Because that's apparently how humans have always fought. Their entire military development was shaped by conflicts against opponents with superior numbers, technology, or resources. Against whom? They've been isolated on their homeworld until recently. Against each other, apparently. Human military history consists of thousands of years of conflicts between different human populations, each trying to overcome opponents with superior capabilities. They developed their military technology by fighting themselves, and by constantly anticipating that they might face opponents more advanced than they were. Human military doctrine assumes that enemies will be more numerous, better equipped, and more technologically sophisticated." The realization was sobering. Most species developed military technology for defense against comparable opponents. Humans had developed it for victory against superior opponents. "What are our options?" asked Admiral Kethvar. "Negotiation," General Hickster replied immediately. "We cannot militarily contain a species that approaches warfare the way humans do." "Negotiation about what? They've already liberated all the workers they wanted to liberate." "Negotiation about the future of human-council relations." Because if we don't find a way to coexist, they're going to keep liberating populations that we consider legitimate labor resources. The emergency session continued for hours, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The Council had expelled humanity to avoid accommodating human moral frameworks, only to discover that humans were prepared to enforce those frameworks through military action. "We have two choices," Admiral Kethrar concluded. "We can continue trying to oppose human interference with our labor practices, knowing that we lack the military capability to stop them, or we can reconsider our approach to labor relations throughout Council space." "You're suggesting we change our entire economic system because one species disapproves of our methods." "I'm suggesting we change our economic system because one species has the military capability to force changes and the moral commitment to use that capability. That sets a dangerous precedent. The precedent was set when we expelled them rather than addressing their concerns. Now we're dealing with the consequences of that decision." The vote to invite humanity back to Council membership passed by a narrow margin, 24 in favor, 23 opposed. The invitation came with formal recognition of human authority to investigate and address labor conditions throughout Council space. Ambassador Sarah Chen received the invitation while her ship was stationed in the Kepler system, overseeing the voluntary relocation of 1.97 million former slaves to new homes throughout human space and allied territories. "The Council has reconsidered its decision regarding human membership," Admiral Kethvar informed her during their video conference. "You're invited to return to full participation in galactic civilization." "Under what terms?" "Full membership with all associated rights and responsibilities, including the right to investigate labor conditions and advocate for vulnerable populations, including formal recognition of human authority to monitor and address situations involving the exploitation of sapient beings." Ambassador Chen considered the offer carefully. It represented everything humanity had been advocating for since joining galactic civilization 20 years earlier. "We accept the invitation," she said finally, "but with conditions." "What conditions?" "Formal establishment of labor standards that recognize the dignity and rights of all sapient beings, independent monitoring of compliance with those standards, and immediate liberation of any populations currently being held in conditions that violate basic principles of consent and fair compensation." Those are significant conditions. Those are the minimum requirements for human participation in galactic civilization. Admiral Kethvar realized that the balance of power in galactic civilization had fundamentally shifted. The Council could no longer ignore human moral frameworks because humans had demonstrated the capability and willingness to enforce those frameworks through military action. "The Council will need time to consider your conditions. The Council has had 20 years to consider our concerns about systematic exploitation of primitive species. How much additional time do you need?" "What if the Council can't accept your conditions?" "Then we'll continue our liberation operations until all enslaved populations have been freed, and we'll establish our own civilization based on principles of dignity and consent." "That would mean the end of galactic civilization as we know it." "That would mean the beginning of galactic civilization based on genuine moral principles, rather than economic exploitation disguised as cultural difference." The call ended with both sides understanding that the future of galactic civilization would be determined by whether the Council could adapt to human moral frameworks or whether humans would create an alternative to the existing order. 3 months later, the Galactic Sentient Rights Charter was signed by all 47 member species, establishing universal standards for the treatment of sapient beings and creating enforcement mechanisms to ensure compliance. The Charter recognized the inherent dignity of all sapient beings regardless of technological development level, species of origin, or economic circumstances. It prohibited forced labor, established minimum standards for living conditions and compensation, and guaranteed the right of all sapient beings to make free choices about their living and working arrangements. Human ships patrolled throughout Council space as enforcement vessels, investigating reports of violations and providing assistance to populations that had been liberated from exploitative conditions. "The irony," Admiral Kethvar observed during the charter signing ceremony, "is that humans achieved through military force what they couldn't achieve through 20 years of diplomatic advocacy." "The greater irony," Ambassador Chen replied, "is that the Council forced us to use military action by refusing to address legitimate moral concerns through peaceful means." Do you think galactic civilization is better now than it was before human intervention? I think galactic civilization is finally becoming worthy of the name. Civilization isn't about technological advancement or economic efficiency. It's about how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. And if we hadn't signed the charter, if we'd continued to resist human demands, then you would have discovered that humans are prepared to fight for their principles regardless of the cost. We didn't come here to negotiate. We came here to end slavery throughout council space. Even if it meant war with the entire galaxy? Especially if it meant war with the entire galaxy, some principles are worth fighting for, no matter what the odds. Admiral Kethvar looked out at the assembled representatives from 47 species, who had just committed to treating all sapient beings with dignity and respect. Humans really are different from every other species we've encountered. How so? Most species develop moral frameworks that justify their survival and success. Humans develop moral frameworks that require them to protect others, even at the cost of their own survival and success. Is that a problem? It's the reason galactic civilization needed humans, even though we didn't realize it at the time. The ceremony concluded with the formal establishment of the Human Rights Enforcement Fleet, a joint human council force responsible for monitoring compliance with the Sentient Rights Charter and providing assistance to vulnerable populations throughout galactic space. Humanity had been betrayed by the Council, expelled from galactic civilization for advocating moral principles that conflicted with established economic practices. But they had returned not as supplicants seeking readmission, but as liberators enforcing universal standards of dignity and justice. The Council had learned that there were worse things than accommodating human moral frameworks. They could be forced to adopt them. And in the end, galactic civilization was better for it. The betrayal had led to total annihilation, not of populations or planets, but of systems of exploitation that had masqueraded as civilization for millennia. And humanity had brought something better to replace what they'd destroyed, the recognition that true civilization meant protecting the weak, not exploiting them. The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly as humanity had intended. The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly as humanity had intended. 6 months after the signing of the Galactic Sentient Rights Charter, Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Liberation, watching her tactical displays track 17 different enforcement operations across council space. The transition from economic exploitation to genuine civilization was proving more complex than anyone had anticipated. "Admiral," reported Commander Martinez from the communications station, "we're receiving another distress call from the Vega system. The Crystalline Collective is requesting immediate assistance with what they're calling a, quote, worker rebellion." Admiral Chen had heard this phrase dozens of times since enforcement operations began. Species that had relied on forced labor for centuries were discovering that their workers had very different ideas about acceptable working conditions when given genuine choices. What's the nature of the situation? The collective claims that recently liberated populations are refusing to continue essential mineral extraction operations, demanding what they call unreasonable compensation and working conditions. And what are they actually demanding? Standard charter provisions, safe working environments, fair wages, reasonable hours, and the right to leave if they choose to work elsewhere. Admiral Chen shook her head. "Dispatch the 7th Enforcement Squadron with a full charter compliance team, and send word to the collective that their operations will remain suspended until they demonstrate full compliance with sentient rights standards." "Yes, ma'am." "Admiral, there's something else. The compliance team from the Perseus mining operation is reporting some unusual findings." "What kind of findings?" "Evidence that the exploitation patterns were more extensive and systematic than we initially realized. They're uncovering documentation of deliberate technological suppression, genetic manipulation to increase worker productivity, and psychological conditioning programs designed to eliminate resistance to authority." The revelation was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. As human enforcement teams conducted detailed investigations of liberated facilities, they were discovering that galactic civilization's approach to primitive species had been far more sophisticated and insidious than simple forced labor. How extensive are these programs? Preliminary estimates suggest they were implemented across at least 40% of council extraction operations. We're looking at systematic efforts to keep entire species in states of technological and social dependency. Send the documentation to the Charter Compliance Commission immediately. This needs to be addressed at the highest levels. The discovery of technological suppression programs represented a new phase in humanity's understanding of what they were fighting against. The Council hadn't just been exploiting primitive species. They'd been actively preventing those species from developing the capabilities that would allow them to resist exploitation. Admiral, Commander Martinez continued, we also have a request from the Independent Systems Alliance. They're asking for human assistance in establishing their own enforcement capabilities. The Independent Systems Alliance was a coalition of species that had never joined the Galactic Trade Council, largely because they'd suspected the Council membership involved compromises they weren't willing to make. The success of human enforcement operations had prompted several neutral species to request assistance in implementing similar protections. What kind of assistance are they requesting? Technical expertise, training for enforcement personnel, and access to human intelligence about exploitation patterns in non-council space. Approved. Assign the 12th Squadron to provide support for Alliance enforcement development. We want to extend charter protections beyond council space. The expansion of human enforcement activities beyond council territory reflected a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. What had begun as an effort to reform galactic civilization was evolving into the creation of an entirely new galactic order based on universal principles of sentient rights. Admiral, reported Tactical Officer Kim, long-range sensors are detecting something unusual in the Outer Rim territories. Multiple large-scale construction projects that don't match any known Council or Alliance activities. What kind of construction projects? Unknown configuration, but the energy signatures suggest massive infrastructure development, possibly shipyards or industrial complexes. Admiral Chen frowned. Unknown construction activities in the Outer Rim could represent several different scenarios, none of them necessarily positive. Any communications traffic associated with these projects? Minimal and heavily encrypted, but Admiral, there's something else. The construction sites are all located in systems that were recently subjected to enforcement operations. Systems where we liberated enslaved populations? Yes, ma'am, 7 different systems, all sites of major liberation operations within the past 4 months. The implication was intriguing and potentially significant. Were the liberated populations building something? If so, what were they building and why? Dispatch reconnaissance drones to those systems. I want detailed analysis of the construction activities and any associated communications. Yes, ma'am. Admiral, we're also receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command. Put it through. The face that appeared on Admiral Chen's screen belonged to Fleet Admiral Jackson, the commander of Earth's military forces and the architect of the liberation strategy that had transformed galactic civilization. Sarah, we need to discuss some developments that could affect our enforcement operations. What kind of developments? Intelligence indicates that several council species are forming what they're calling a, quote, traditional values coalition. They're apparently planning to resist charter implementation through coordinated economic and political pressure. What form is this resistance taking? Trade embargoes against species that fully comply with charter standards, political pressure on neutral species to avoid cooperation with human enforcement, and propaganda campaigns claiming that human values are incompatible with galactic diversity. Admiral Chen had been expecting something like this. The Charter had fundamentally disrupted economic relationships that had existed for millennia. Some species were bound to resist changes that threatened their traditional advantages. How serious is this coalition? Serious enough to potentially destabilize the entire enforcement framework if they succeed in isolating compliant species from galactic commerce. What are our options? That's what we need to discuss. The coalition represents about 15 council species, including some with significant military capabilities. If they coordinate their resistance effectively, we could face a much larger conflict than anything we've dealt with so far. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from the tactical station. Admiral, reported Officer Kim, we're receiving an emergency transmission from the Altair system. Human enforcement personnel are reporting that they're under attack by unknown vessels. Admiral Chen's attention immediately shifted to the tactical emergency. What's the nature of the attack? Unknown vessels, possibly Council military units, conducting coordinated strikes against our enforcement facilities and transport ships. Casualties? Unknown at this time, The transmission was cut off mid-report. Fleet Admiral Jackson's expression grew grim. "Sarah, it looks like the Traditional Values Coalition has decided to move beyond economic resistance." "Orders, sir?" "Deploy the 3rd and 5th Fleets to the Altair system immediately. If Council species are attacking human enforcement personnel, we respond with overwhelming force." "Understood. And our overall strategy for dealing with the Coalition?" "We demonstrate that attacking human enforcement operations carries consequences that outweigh any potential benefits of resistance." The Altair system was 12 hours away at maximum fleet speed, but Admiral Chen dispatched advanced reconnaissance units immediately to assess the situation and provide assistance to any surviving enforcement personnel. The reports that came back were sobering. The unknown attackers had specifically targeted human enforcement facilities while avoiding Council installations, suggesting coordinated action by species that knew exactly what they were trying to accomplish. "Admiral," reported Commander Martinez after reviewing the reconnaissance data, "the attack appears to have been conducted by a coalition of Council species using unmarked vessels. They destroyed our enforcement headquarters, disabled 3 transport ships, and captured approximately 200 human personnel." "Captured? Not killed?" "The attackers appear to have made deliberate efforts to minimize casualties while maximizing disruption to our operations." "That's interesting. What's their apparent objective?" "Unknown, but the pattern suggests they're trying to force us to negotiate rather than simply eliminate our enforcement capabilities." Admiral Chen was processing the implications when another urgent communication arrived, this time from an unexpected source. "Admiral Chen," came the voice through the communications channel, "this is Counselor Vextai of the Traditional Values Coalition. We need to discuss the current situation." "Counselor, if you're responsible for the attack on our enforcement personnel, we have nothing to discuss until those personnel are returned unharmed. The personnel are safe and will be returned once we've had an opportunity to present our concerns about the implementation of Charter standards. Your concerns should be addressed through the Charter Compliance Commission, not through attacks on enforcement operations. The Commission is dominated by human representatives and species that have accepted human values without consideration of galactic diversity and cultural autonomy. The Commission is composed of representatives from all Charter signatory species, and its decisions are based on universal principles of sentient rights. Universal principles according to human moral frameworks, but galactic civilization encompasses species with fundamentally different approaches to social organization and economic relationships." Admiral Chen found herself in a familiar debate, but with higher stakes than previous discussions. "Counselor, are you arguing that some species have the right to enslave others based on cultural differences?" "We're arguing that human definitions of slavery, exploitation, and individual rights may not apply universally across all species and all social contexts." "Give me a specific example." "The Hive Collective operates through biological integration that humans interpret as loss of individual autonomy. But for the collective, individual autonomy is a meaningless concept, because their consciousness operates collectively rather than individually." "And you're saying that other species should be forced to integrate into the collective without their consent?" "We're saying that consent itself may be a culturally specific concept that doesn't apply to species with fundamentally different cognitive structures." The argument was more sophisticated than previous Council attempts to justify exploitation, but Admiral Chen recognized it as essentially the same rationalization dressed in academic language. "Counselor, the Charter specifically addresses species with collective consciousness. Forced integration is prohibited regardless of the cognitive structure of the target species. But the Charter was written by species with individualistic consciousness structures. How can it adequately address the needs and rights of collective consciousness species? By recognizing that consciousness structure doesn't justify forcing others to adopt that structure without their informed consent. What constitutes informed consent for a species that has never experienced individual consciousness?" It was a genuinely complex question that touched on fundamental issues of cognition, culture, and universal rights. But Admiral Chen suspected that the Traditional Values Coalition was using philosophical complexity to avoid addressing practical realities. "Counselor, these are important questions that deserve serious consideration, but they don't justify attacking human enforcement personnel or capturing our people. We captured your personnel to ensure that you would be willing to engage in serious discussion about these issues rather than simply imposing human solutions through military force. So you're holding our people hostage to force philosophical discussions?" We're ensuring that human representatives understand the stakes involved in imposing universal standards on diverse galactic civilization. We're ensuring that human representatives understand the stakes involved in imposing universal standards on diverse galactic civilization. Admiral Chen paused, looking out at the stars through the bridge viewport. After a long moment, she turned back to the communication screen. Counselor Vextai, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding. What misunderstanding? You believe we're imposing human standards on galactic civilization, but we're not. Then what are you doing? We're enforcing the standards that sapient beings choose for themselves when they're given the freedom to choose. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Every species we've liberated has chosen dignity over exploitation when given the option, Admiral Chen continued. Every population we freed has chosen fair treatment over abuse when they were allowed to make that choice. These aren't human standards being imposed. These are universal preferences being revealed. Counselor, the stakes you're concerned about aren't about cultural diversity versus human imperialism. They're about whether powerful species will continue to have the right to prevent other species from choosing their own standards of treatment. You want to preserve your right to make choices for others. We're simply ensuring that others get to make choices for themselves. Admiral Chen cut the communication and turned to her tactical officer. Signal the fleet. All enforcement operations continue as scheduled. If the Traditional Values Coalition wants to understand the stakes, they're about to learn them. The galaxy had voted to expel humanity rather than address systematic oppression. Humanity had returned with a simple message: everyone deserves the right to choose their own fate. And they had brought the fleet to ensure that choice was protected. The stakes were perfectly clear. The end